Africa is a continent that is so blindingly bright and complex that it makes my head hurt. You know, if it were a dark continent, we wouldn't be having this unit right now. So Africa is like this incredibly diverse place, right? It has these incredible stories of the richest people ever the richest man ever in history, Mansa Musa, came from Africa. And at the same time, we also get some of the poorest people in the world coming from Africa. So Africa really has that socio-economic diversity that a lot of places don't really have. Like even America has poor people and rich people, but it's not nearly as diverse as Africa. And if we take a look at this map, which you guys already saw, you see that Africa has all these different ethnic groups. It has around 2,000 to 3,000 of these ethnic groups, which is more than any other continent, which is probably more than any other continent has ever had. And if you take a closer look at it, you'll see that the nation states that had the lines that were drawn onto this map, like their borders often cross the lines of the tribes. And so this, as you'll learn later in the unit, it was not a particularly good method for organizing Africa because it's not very effective, and in some places, such as Rwanda right here, it's led to not very happy endings. And then this is another map in which you can look at that more closely. So this is just your general ethnic borders map, and then this is what the ethnic borders with the nation-state borders drawn onto them, and you can see the places where there are divisions, and as you'll notice, there's a lot of them that are this maroon color right here. And so basically the reason for Africa's incredible diversity is, in fact, its geography. The fact that Africa has such a varied geography is important. Now, you guys already read about Africa's varied geography, but for the people that didn't really read about it and only kind of like bluffed their way through the quiz and whatever, for those people, Africa is home to many very important rivers, such as the Niger River, the Congo River, the Zambezi, such as the Niger River, the Congo River, the Zambezi River, the Senegal River up here, the Orange River down here, and of course the Nile River, which splits into the Blue Nile and the White Nile. It's also home to deserts such as the Sahara Desert up in the north, and the Kalahari Desert down here, and the Namib Desert over here. It's home, but the main thing is that Africa is mostly plateaus, and as you know, plateaus are raised pieces of land that are like above sea level, and so one of the most famous ones is the Katanga Plateau. It's the easiest one to see. And so what these plateaus basically do is that they make it so that Africa does not have a lot of farmable land. Like in the plateaus, the only places you can really farm are along these rivers, which is also the case in India with the Deccan Plateau. And so most of Africa is not actually farmable, which is part of the reason why a lot of African societies did not develop farming, and Africa's population didn't grow that rapidly. And of course, Africa, at the edges of its plateaus, has mountains, and some of the most famous being the Ethiopian highlands and the Eastern Rift Mountains, which include Mount Kilimanjaro. And it also has some other cool geographical features like these basins, the Congo Basin, plains, Serengeti Plain, valleys like the Great Rift Valley over in these areas. Rainforests, there are quite a few rainforests over in the Central African Republic, which is right around here. And it has some lakes, like Lake Chad up in Chad, and Lake Victoria down here. And of course, the most impressive thing about Africa, which you learned from Mr. Kirsten's presentation on Wednesday, is that Africa has a lot of on Tuesday, Africa has a lot of natural resources which came from its geological history. It's not just got a lot of natural resources, it's got a huge variety of them too, all over the place. It's got gold, iron, manganese, copper, all of these things, and this also contributed to Africa's incredible diversity, and we'll look more at this later. Africa's also got a very interesting climate. So Africa's climate is uh, it is like mostly tropical, in the sense that it's kind of hot in Africa, and that's because Africa is divided almost perfectly in half by the equator, and Africa is and like its different climate zones seem to be like almost mirror images north and south. Like if you go up towards the Tropic of Cancer, you go rainforest, savanna, not steppe. Instead, we're gonna skip the steppe one, although it is sometimes included. And then we get desert, and then we get the coastal one, or as they call it, the Mediterranean. As you will notice, the Mediterranean is not a climate, but it is actually a sea up here. And also, you'll notice there's no Mediterranean Sea in the south. And yeah, and you see the same thing going rainforest, savanna, desert, coastal. And so these climate zones, you might think that the varied climate contributed to Africa's diversity, which it did, but the fact is that the northern cultures are still not similar to the southern cultures because for multiple other reasons, even though their climates are different. So even though the climate of the north and the climate of the south are mirror images of each other, they did not have similar cultural and other types of development. The only development that this really affected was how the population was distributed, as we'll look at a bit later. And so an important thing to know about when studying African geography is like how did geography literally impact the diversity of Africa? And so if we look at this one instance of the Bantu migrations, so the Bantus were this group of migrants that originated up here in Western Africa, and over the course of thousands of years, they slowly migrated all over the whole continent. So if we just look at these arrows, they basically went from up here in this Nigeria-ish region all the way down to this South Africa-ish region, and they left this huge legacy where they spread their language and their ironworking and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so the main thing that we're going to look at here in this map is, or not really on the map, but the main thing that's important to note is that the Bantus established five types of societies depending on the geography of the locations that they came across. And most importantly, these 5 types of societies still exist to this date in Africa. Like, they have not really moved on from these 5 types of societies, and they're still predominant. And these 5 types are farming societies, herding societies, fishing societies, hunter-gatherer societies, and urban. Now, of all of these, the one that is the closest to going away is the hunter-gatherer societies. But in places like Tanzania and Kenya, the Maasai still engage in hunting and gathering, and the Serengeti still engage in hunting and gathering, and so it's still kind of there. And so now, if we look at the global and now let's take a look at the global perspective, right? So Africa is not just like its own continent, right? Africa is like just one continent, but its location in the world is part of what gives it its incredible diversity. So not only did it create its own cultural diversity from its own geography, but also its geographic placement with other countries and other continents outside of Africa gave it some of its diversity. So we can see up here in the north, Africa interacted a lot with Europe, which was the case going as far back at least to the ancient Greeks. In fact, during the reign of ancient Rome, Rome had the Punic Wars with Carthage, which was a North African city. And over here in the northeast and east, we see that Africa probably had a lot of interactions with Arabia and India, which was the case. If we take a look at this next map, we see that this trading network happened between the west coast of India, and like there was trading going on over here as well, but between India and Arabia and Africa, and so this was a huge trade interaction. In fact, this was so big that these cities on the eastern coast of Africa came to be known as the Swahili city-states because they weren't really ruled by a country, but more importantly, they had this really cool and really strange cultural combination of Bantu culture from the Bantu migrations, which we talked about earlier, Arabic culture, specifically Islam in these city-states, and of course Indian culture. And so all of that you can find in these city-states. And another thing that's really interesting before we move on is that Mogadishu, one of the Swahili city-states, we now know it as the capital of Somalia, which we all see as an anarchist nation. But the point of this course is to move beyond stereotypes. So if we take a look at Mogadishu, it was like the first African city that traders would interact with when coming from Arabia, like the first major one, especially the only one that's on this, like the first one that's on this map that a line directly connects to. So we see here that Mogadishu is not actually like the super anarchist place. It used to be it used to be one of the centers of trade in the Indian Ocean, which I think is pretty cool. And so now let's take a look at the different kinds of diversity. So the first type of diversity that we're going to take a look at in Africa is economic diversity. So this was back when this was back before globalization took place, which is when globalization is when everyone is involved with trade all over the place, right? So this economic diversity was we can like actually see the geography in place. So this trade going up in the Sahara Desert, called the Trans-Saharan trade. This was basically limited to the Sahara and, of course, the Niger River. And so the thing that's really cool about this is that this trade network interacted with this trade network, called the Sub-Saharan Trade Network, only through the sea. Like, there were probably interactions over land, but the most predominant interactions between like Benin City and Great Zimbabwe were when goods traveled up here all the way to Cairo and then down all the way down down Eastern Africa and then to Great Zimbabwe. So what we see here is that geography really limited the interactions of the North and the South, which is part of the reason why they developed their own identities, their own cultures. And so because trade was so long distance, we can actually like see how geography impacted the trade networks of these different regions. And then this is a more modern look at the economic diversity of Africa. So if we just take a look at this map, we can see there's a huge variety of goods being of like resources and sometimes goods being exported from Africa. So if we just take a look at the key, we see that there's oil being exported, there's food being exported, metals, precious metals, wood, textiles, machinery, electronics, and then like this, and then like tobacco and some other stuff. And so the reason why this is important is because if we take a look again at our resources map, we see that Africa has this huge variety of natural resources. And now if we go forward to our economic diversity map, our exports map, we see that those resources are being exported in their diverse manner. And so in this way, we see that each nation has adopted pretty much its own economic identity based on the resources it has available to it or the resources that it can produce most effectively for its climate and everything. And now let's take a look at population density diversity, right? So if we take a look at this map, we can clearly see how geography is at play. Nigeria, right along this region, is where the Niger River crosses, and at the coast and up here in the north of Nigeria, we see that the population is the densest. But here, the Sahara Desert is pretty much like completely unoccupied, and also the Kalahari Desert. A lot of the places in the Kalahari Desert are unoccupied. But if we go back to the rivers, right here there's a river, right here there's a river, there's a lake, and of course this is the Nile, which is outlined so spectacularly by the population. And so in all of these regions, what we can see is that the geography is directly affecting where people live. People don't want to live in the desert because it's a terrible place to live, but people do want to live along rivers because that's where you get the most food and everything. And now let's take a look at religious diversity. So if we think back to the global perspective map, we saw that in the north, Europe interacted a lot with North Africa interacted a lot with Europe and Arabia. And even though initially there was a lot of Christianity spreading to this region, Europe in the Middle Ages actually kind of stopped like trying to leave Europe until like the High Middle Ages, which was later. And so in that period, Arabia actually expanded all throughout the Sahara Desert. They conquered Egypt, they conquered Morocco over here, and Islam slowly spread via conquest and via missionaries that wanted to spread it in this northern region. In this eastern region, we see a little something different. This was the region of the Swahili city-states, and the fact that Islam spread to this region was not due to conquests or missionaries, but actually due to trade. And trade is actually one of the largest spreaders of religion, and Islam was no different. In fact, Islam was probably the religion that was spread most by trade in history. In this southern region, we see a lot more Christianity, and the reason for this is because this region was a lot less affected by Islam when Islam was being expanded to to Africa. And so when the Europeans started carving up Africa, the northern region and the eastern region already had a strong Muslim identity. But this middle region was mostly following their own tribal religions, which Christians thought were quite simple to suppress because a lot of them relied on these ideas of magic, which the Christian people of Europeans, I should be saying, the Europeans knew how to sort of discredit those ideas of magic, whereas Islam was quite similar to Christianity in its stories and its beliefs, so it was a lot harder to discredit that. So when Europe divided up northern Africa, it was much harder to get converts to Christianity than when they were dividing up southern Africa. And now, and now let's take a little bit of a turn from religion to just culture in general. So if we take a look at the 4 African language families, we'll see that this is pretty much how geography has functioned. So up here in the north, we see Afro-Asiatic. And what does that mean? It's basically a combination of the traditional African languages and the Arabic language that was brought over by the Islamic conquests and missionaries. And down in the south, it's primarily the Bantu language family that's spoken, and that's because of the Bantu migrations that happened from like the Nigeria area all the way down to the rest of Africa. And of course, we can see that the Swahili city-states were also affected by the Bantu migrations, which is how we know that they're part of the Bantu language family. And then some of these other regions, these Nilo-Saharan language families correspond quite well to mountainous regions in northern Africa, even though they look kind of random. And this Khoisan region actually corresponds to that one region of a desert that's separated from the general Kalahari Desert in the south. And now let's talk about food, or rather, in this case, beer. If we take a look at the beer in Africa, we can see that there's an incredible diversity of which kind of beer that the countries prefer, which I thought was funny, so I put it in this presentation. And last of all, food. So Africa has a diverse variety, has like a diverse group of the kind of food or like crops it produces or consumes. And so we can kind of just see that in this really cool food map of Africa. And that is the end of this presentation. So basically, what I hope you've taken away from this presentation is that Africa's like incredible diversity, whether it's economic diversity or population diversity or religious or cultural, all of that is dependent on its geography, whether it's national geography or physical geography. That geography is extremely important in determining how Africa's diversity has been shaped. Thank you.